The car rolled to a stop in a small clearing deep within the dense Oregon forest. Karen, a slim, sharp-featured woman in her late 30s, glanced at her daughter, Emily, through the rearview mirror. Her brown eyes were cold, but she forced a faint, practiced smile as she stepped out of the driver's seat. "Let's take a break here, sweetie," she said, her voice unnaturally cheery. Emily, a 12-year-old girl with striking blue eyes and chestnut hair that fell in loose waves to her shoulders, nodded hesitantly. Her wheelchair was tightly secured in the back seat, and Karen moved quickly, unlatching it with the efficiency of someone who had done it countless times before. Emily sensed something off in her mother's demeanor. She had grown accustomed to Karen's mood swings. Some days, she was warm and caring, but most days, there was a simmering frustration beneath her words. "Why are we stopping here, Mom? This doesn't look like a trail," Emily asked as Karen wheeled her toward a patch of soft grass. The forest around them was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Emily's voice broke the stillness, her tone edged with unease. Karen crouched down in front of her daughter and cupped her hands over Emily's small, delicate ones. "We've been through a lot, haven't we, sweetheart?" she began, her voice syrupy and fake. I need a little time to think. You'll be fine here for a bit. It's so peaceful, don't you think?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. She looked at her mother's face, searching for reassurance but finding only a fleeting trace of guilt. "You're leaving me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. No, of course not," Karen lied, standing up abruptly and brushing imaginary dirt off her jeans. "I just need to run back to the car to grab something. Stay here and enjoy the fresh air." Karen turned and walked away, her pace brisk. Emily watched as her mother disappeared into the tree line, the sound of her footsteps fading with each passing second. A knot of fear tightened in Emily's chest. Minutes ticked by, and Karen didn't return. "Mom?" Emily called out, her voice cracking. She twisted in her wheelchair, trying to catch a glimpse of movement, but the forest remained still. The towering trees seemed to close in around her, and the chirping of distant birds felt like a mockery of her rising panic. She clenched her hands on the armrests of her chair, her breathing shallow. "This isn't funny, Mom. Come back," she yelled, tears welling in her eyes. But Karen was gone. Emily looked around the clearing. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and patches of moss. Her wheelchair was not built for this terrain, and she knew it. She tried moving forward, but the wheels sank slightly into the soft dirt, resisting her efforts. Frustration and fear bubbled up, and she slammed her hands against the armrests. Why would she do this? Emily whispered to herself, tears now streaming freely down her face. Her mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Had Karen really abandoned her here? What was she supposed to do now? The sunlight began to wane, casting long shadows over the clearing. Emily's fingers trembled as she wiped her face, trying to think clearly. The forest, which had seemed peaceful earlier, now felt ominous. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made her jump. Hours passed, and Emily's hope of seeing her mother again dwindled. The truth she had been trying to deny settled heavily in her chest. Karen wasn't coming back. As darkness crept into the clearing, Emily's tears dried, replaced by a steely resolve. Her mother might have left her here, but she wasn't going to give up. She had faced challenges before. She would face this one too. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's howl pierced the quiet, making Emily shiver. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tightly, her eyes scanning the darkening forest. She was utterly alone, or so she thought. The forest seemed to grow darker by the second. Emily's wheelchair was stuck in the soft dirt of the clearing, and every attempt to move only made her frustration grow. She clenched her fists, her heart pounding as the shadows stretched around her. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to take slow, deep breaths. "I need to think. Panicking won't help me." Her voice echoed weakly as she called out again, "Mom, please come back." The only answer was the rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or chirp of an unseen bird. Emily looked around, trying to take in her surroundings. The clearing was surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches intertwined so tightly that they seemed to form a canopy. The ground was uneven and littered with rocks and fallen branches. This wasn't a place where people stopped for a picnic. It was remote, wild, and unwelcoming. Her stomach churned as she thought back to Karen's strange behavior earlier. The overly sweet tone of her mother's voice replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. She planned this, didn't she? Emily thought, tears welling up again. She left me here on purpose. The thought was like a punch to the gut, but she pushed it aside. Crying wasn't going to help. She needed to focus on survival. Emily reached into the small bag Karen had left hanging on the back of her wheelchair. Inside, she found a water bottle, a granola bar, and her phone. Relief washed over her briefly, but it was short-lived when she saw there was no signal. Of course, she muttered bitterly, tossing the phone onto her lap. Why would anything work out for me? Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the granola bar and took small bites, more out of necessity than hunger. The sweet, dry taste did little to comfort her. She sipped from the water bottle sparingly, knowing she had to ration what little she had. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Stay put, conserve energy, and wait for help, she thought, echoing advice she had read in survival books. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, her confidence began to waver. The forest transformed into an entirely different world at night. The darkness was impenetrable, and the noises of the forest grew louder and more menacing. Twigs snapped in the distance, and the occasional hoot of an owl sent chills down her spine. Emily fumbled with her phone, turning on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light illuminated the immediate area, but it also seemed to make the darkness beyond feel even more oppressive. She swung the light back and forth, hoping to catch a glimpse of something. Anything. Mom, help, she screamed again, her voice raw and hoarse. She hated how small and helpless she sounded, but there was no one to hear her anyway. Suddenly, she heard a sound that made her freeze. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the chirping of crickets. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from somewhere behind her. Emily's hands tightened around the flashlight, and she swung it toward the source of the sound. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes scanned the area illuminated by the beam of light, but she saw nothing, just trees and shadows. The growl came again, closer this time. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breathing became shallow. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, clutching the arms of her wheelchair. Stay calm. But calm was impossible when the growl turned into the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Emily's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she thought the batteries would die. She frantically hit the side of the phone, and the light steadied. That's when she saw them, two glowing eyes, reflecting the beam of her flashlight. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged from the shadows. It was a wolf. Its dark fur blended seamlessly with the night, and its piercing eyes seemed to lock onto hers. The animal's sheer size was overwhelming, and Emily felt a wave of terror wash over her. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even think. The wolf stood there, watching her. It didn't attack, but it didn't retreat either. Emily's mind raced, trying to recall anything she knew about wolves. "Don't run. Don't make sudden movements," she reminded herself. Not that running was an option for her. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't hurt me." The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if it understood her plea. Its growl ceased, replaced by a curious silence. It took a cautious step forward, and Emily's grip on the flashlight tightened. She wanted to close her eyes, to disappear, but she couldn't look away. And then, to her astonishment, the wolf sat down a few feet away from her. It didn't bare its teeth or lower its head in a threatening manner. Instead, it simply watched her, its gaze steady and almost protective. Emily's terror began to wane, replaced by a strange sense of awe. She didn't understand what was happening, but for the first time since her mother had left, she didn't feel entirely alone. The forest had grown eerily quiet, save for the soft rustle of the trees swaying in the cool night breeze. Emily kept her flashlight trained on the wolf sitting a few feet away, its glowing eyes reflecting the light like twin beacons in the dark. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had shifted into something more complex, an uneasy mixture of curiosity and caution. The wolf didn't move, its posture relaxed yet alert. It tilted its head again, as if studying her. Emily's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She whispered to herself, trying to gather courage, "Stay calm. Just stay calm." The wolf's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was as if the animal could understand her, though she knew that was impossible. But then again, nothing about this situation felt normal. Why wasn't it attacking? Why was it just sitting there? "I am not going to hurt you," she stammered, her voice trembling. Saying it out loud made her feel absurd. Why would I even say that? It's a wolf. The wolf blinked slowly, its massive frame illuminated by the beam of her flashlight. Its fur was thick and dark, blending seamlessly with the shadows of the forest. Emily noticed the faint outlines of its ribs as it breathed, a reminder that this was a wild animal, likely driven by hunger. Her stomach clenched at the thought. She glanced at the granola bar wrapper still crumpled in her lap. An idea sparked in her mind, though she wasn't sure if it was brave or stupid. She carefully reached for the wrapper and held it up. "I don't have much, but do you want this?" Her voice cracked, but she unfolded the wrapper with slow, deliberate movements. She broke off the last piece of the granola bar and hesitated before tossing it a short distance toward the wolf. The small piece landed in the grass with a soft rustle. The wolf sniffed the air, its nose twitching. It hesitated for a moment before standing up. Emily tensed, every muscle in her body rigid as the animal approached the offering. Its movements were cautious but fluid, each step silent on the forest floor. When it reached the granola, it lowered its massive head and sniffed again before taking the morsel into its jaws. Emily exhaled shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath. The wolf didn't look at her as it chewed, but its calm demeanor made her heart race less fiercely. She tried to steady her breathing, watching its every move. "Shadow," she whispered, the name slipping from her lips without much thought. The wolf's dark fur and the way it seemed to meld with the night made the name feel fitting. "I'll call you Shadow." The wolf finished the granola and sat back down, licking its chops. Emily wasn't sure if the animal had accepted her or if it was simply full, but she took it as a small victory. For the first time that night, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. But that hope was fragile. She knew the danger she was still in. The wolf could change its demeanor at any moment, and the forest remained an unpredictable, unforgiving place. As the minutes stretched into hours, Emily tried to keep herself awake, fearing what might happen if she let her guard down. At some point, she began to speak softly, more to herself than to Shadow. "I don't know why you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad I'm not alone." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it didn't move. Emily couldn't explain why, but she felt an odd connection to the animal. Maybe it was the sheer desperation of her situation, or the fact that it hadn't harmed her when it easily could have. Either way, Shadow's presence, as strange as it was, gave her a sense of comfort. As the hours dragged on, the moon rose high in the sky, casting a pale light over the clearing. Emily's exhaustion was becoming impossible to ignore. She rested her head against the back of her wheelchair, her eyelids growing heavy. Shadow remained where it was, its gaze fixed on the forest as if standing guard. "Thank you," Emily murmured, her voice barely audible as sleep began to claim her. "For not leaving me." Shadow didn't react, but Emily thought she saw its ears flick again, almost as if it understood. Emily woke with a start, the cold morning air biting at her cheeks. She blinked groggily, disoriented for a moment as she took in her surroundings. The clearing was bathed in the dim light of dawn, and the forest seemed less menacing in the soft glow. She shivered and rubbed her arms, realizing how cold the night had been. Then she saw Shadow. The wolf lay curled a few feet away, its dark fur blending with the shadows of the undergrowth. Its head rested on its paws, and its eyes were half closed, but Emily could tell it was still alert. She had expected it to be gone by morning, But there it was, keeping a silent vigil. "Good morning, Shadow," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the previous night's crying and shouting. She didn't expect a response, but the wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. A small, involuntary smile crept across her face. For the first time since being left in the forest, she didn't feel completely hopeless. Her stomach growled loudly, pulling her thoughts back to reality. The granola bar from the night before had been her only food, and she had no idea how long she'd be stuck here. She glanced at her phone again, praying for a signal. Nothing. The dreaded "no service" icon stared back at her. "I have to figure something out," she muttered to herself, eyeing the uneven terrain surrounding the clearing. Her wheelchair wasn't made for this kind of ground, and moving it felt almost impossible, but staying put wasn't an option either. She had no idea if anyone would find her, and the thought of spending another night here was unbearable. Shadow stirred, lifting its massive head to watch her. Its amber eyes were sharp and intelligent, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf understood her situation. She stared back at it, an idea forming in her mind. "Okay, this is crazy," she said aloud, her voice trembling with nervous laughter. "But maybe you can help me." She reached down and grabbed the bag attached to the back of her wheelchair. It was light, containing little more than a spare sweater and an empty water bottle. She rummaged through it, trying to think of a way to make herself more mobile. Her hands trembled as she tied the sweater around the armrests, creating a makeshift harness. "Let's see if you're as friendly as you seem," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and hope. She held out the tied sweater toward Shadow, who had been watching her every move. The wolf tilted its head, sniffing the air cautiously before stepping closer. Emily's heart raced as the enormous animal approached. She tried to keep her movements slow and deliberate, her breathing steady. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice soft and soothing. Shadow sniffed the sweater and nudged it with his nose, his tail swishing slightly. Emily let out a shaky laugh, surprised by the gentleness of the massive creature. She carefully looped the sweater over Shadow's neck, her hands trembling as she tied it securely. The wolf didn't resist, standing still as she worked. When she was done, she sat back, staring at her makeshift contraption. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Okay," she said, gripping the wheels of her chair. "Let's see if this works." Shadow seemed to understand her unspoken command. The wolf moved forward, and to Emily's amazement, her wheelchair inched along the uneven ground. It wasn't easy. The wheels bumped over rocks and roots, and she had to use her arms to help guide the chair. But it was progress. Emily couldn't help but laugh, a mix of relief and disbelief. "You're really doing it, Shadow. You're actually helping me." The wolf glanced back at her, its amber eyes calm and steady. For the first time since her mother had abandoned her, Emily felt a spark of hope. Shadow wasn't just a wild animal anymore. He was her ally, her protector. As they moved slowly through the forest, Emily talked to Shadow, her voice filling the otherwise silent woods. She told him about her life, about her mother's unpredictable temper and her grandfather's kindness. "You'd like Grandpa," she said, her voice soft. "He's a lot like you. Quiet but strong." Shadow didn't respond, of course, but the way he glanced back at her now and then made her feel like he was listening. They made slow but steady progress, weaving through the dense forest. Emily had no idea where they were headed, but with Shadow leading the way, she felt safer than she had in days. The bond between girl and wolf grew with each passing hour. Though the path was uncertain and the challenges immense, Emily began to believe that together, they might just find a way out of the forest. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of the forest, its weathered walls steeped in decades of memories. John wiped his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed as he glanced at the clock. The evening had come and gone, and Karen hadn't returned with Emily. Something felt wrong. John was a man of few words, his rugged face marked by years of hard labor and quiet endurance. At 62, his gray-streaked hair and calloused hands reflected a life spent working the land. He was known in their small Oregon town as a kind but no-nonsense man, the kind of person who always kept his promises, especially to Emily. His granddaughter was his world. Born with spina bifida, Emily had faced challenges that would break most people, but she was resilient, a fighter. John admired her spirit, her sharp wit, and her love of books. He often said Emily had the wisdom of someone twice her age, and he had made it his mission to ensure she always felt valued, no matter what. He folded the rag carefully and set it aside. His gut told him something was wrong, something beyond Karen's usual irresponsibility. He had tried calling her several times, but there was no answer. The last text he'd received from her hours ago had been cryptic. "We're going to the forest. Emily needs some fresh air." He grabbed his jacket, slipping the flashlight and a hunting knife into the deep pockets. His heart raced as he stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face. Mary, his wife, called from the doorway, her voice tinged with worry. "John? What's going on? Karen's not back yet. Something's not right." His tone was grim as he pulled on his boots. Mary stepped closer, her arms crossed against the chill. She was a petite woman, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun, and her face bore the same worry as John's. "You think she'd leave Emily out there alone?" John hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to think that, but I'm going to find out." Mary nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Be careful, and bring her back safe." "I will," John promised, his voice steady but low. With that, he grabbed his flashlight and headed into the woods. The familiar crunch of the forest floor beneath his boots was little comfort. The woods had always been a place of peace for John, a refuge. But tonight, they felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. He called Emily's name as he walked, his voice echoing through the trees. "Emily, it's Grandpa. Can you hear me?" There was no answer, only the whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. He shone his flashlight along the path, scanning for any sign of his granddaughter. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, but they felt endless tonight. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound made his heart race. As he ventured deeper, memories of Emily flooded his mind. Her laugh when she beat him at chess, the way her face lit up when she talked about her favorite books. The thought of her alone in the dark forest made his chest tighten. He clenched his fists, his determination growing with every step. "Karen, what did you do?" he muttered under his breath, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew his daughter well enough to suspect the worst. Karen had always been selfish, prioritizing her own needs over Emily's. But abandoning her? It was unthinkable. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. John's voice was hoarse from shouting, but he refused to stop. He scanned every inch of the trail, looking for broken branches, wool tracks, anything that might lead him to Emily. He paused near a clearing, his flashlight catching a faint glimmer on the ground. He knelt down, picking up a crumpled granola bar wrapper. "Emily," he whispered, clutching the wrapper tightly. It was hers, he was sure of it. He looked around, his flashlight illuminating the clearing. It was empty, but the sight of the wrapper renewed his resolve. John stood, his voice firm as he shouted again. "Emily, I'm coming for you, sweetheart. Just hold on." The forest felt like it was holding its breath, the stillness unnerving. But John pressed on, his steps quickening. Somewhere deep in the woods, his granddaughter was waiting for him. And nothing, not the cold, not the darkness, would stop him from finding her. Emily stirred awake as the first hints of moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees. Her body was stiff, her hands cold from gripping the armrests of her wheelchair all night. As she opened her eyes, she saw Shadow lying nearby, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of the forest. The wolf had stayed close, an unspoken promise of protection that gave her some sense of security, however fragile. The forest had taken on a different personality under the moonlight. The trees stood like towering sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Shadows danced on the ground, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Still here? Huh," she whispered, her voice raspy. Shadow's ears perked up at her words, and his amber eyes turned toward her. She couldn't help but smile, despite her fear. "You're not like any wolf I've ever read about." Her mind drifted back to the books she loved, stories of survival, of unlikely bonds between humans and animals. But those were just stories. This was real, and she was far from home, with no idea how or if she'd get out. A sharp snap of a twig nearby made her freeze. Shadow's ears swiveled toward the sound, and he rose to his feet, his body tense. Emily's heart raced as she gripped the flashlight in her lap. She swung the beam of light toward the noise, but all she saw were the dense trees and undergrowth. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but his low growl sent chills down her spine. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, placing himself between her and the source of the sound. Emily's mind raced. What if it's another animal? Or worse, someone else? The thought of encountering a stranger in the woods terrified her. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, trying to steady her breathing. Minutes passed, and the forest fell silent again. Shadow eventually relaxed, his growl fading as he returned to her side. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "You scared it off, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice filled with both gratitude and awe. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against Shadow's thick fur. He flinched slightly at first but didn't pull away. Encouraged, Emily stroked his back gently. The warmth of his body against her cold hands was comforting, a small moment of solace in the overwhelming darkness. "Thank you," she murmured, "for staying, for keeping me safe." Shadow lay down again, his eyes scanning the forest. Emily leaned back in her wheelchair, exhaustion washing over her. Despite the danger and uncertainty, she felt a strange sense of calm with Shadow nearby. It was as though the wolf had taken on the role of her guardian, a silent protector in the unforgiving wilderness. As the night wore on, Emily's mind wandered. She thought about her grandfather, John, and how he always told her she was stronger than she thought. "You're tougher than nails, kiddo," he'd say, ruffling her hair. The memory made her chest tighten. "Please find me, Grandpa. Please." Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing through the trees. Emily's eyelids grew heavy, but she fought to stay awake. The fear of what might happen if she let her guard down kept her alert. Shadow, however, didn't seem to share her struggle. His body remained still, but his ears flicked occasionally, alert to every sound. Emily marveled at his vigilance. "You're not going to let anything happen to me, are you?" she whispered. The wolf didn't respond, but his presence was answer enough. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. Emily dozed off at times, jerking awake at every unfamiliar sound. Each time, Shadow was there, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. As dawn began to break, painting the horizon with hues of pink and orange, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. The long night had been a test of her will, and though she was exhausted and scared, she was still here. With Shadow by her side, she felt a flicker of hope. Somehow, someway, she would make it out of this forest. And she knew, deep down, that Shadow would be with her every step of the way. The first light of dawn filtered through the towering pines, casting long, golden beams across the forest floor. Emily blinked awake, the sharp morning chill biting at her cheeks. Her fingers were stiff from gripping the armrests of her wheelchair through the night, and her muscles ached from exhaustion. Shadow stood nearby, his dark coat glistening faintly in the morning light. He had been alert all night, his ears twitching at every rustle and snap. Now, he looked toward the woods, his body tense, as though sensing something Emily couldn't. "What is it?" she asked, her voice weak from fatigue. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing beyond the trees. Still, Shadow's posture made her uneasy. A faint sound reached her ears, a distant rustling, steady and deliberate, accompanied by the faint crunch of boots on the forest floor. Emily's heart leaped. Was it help? Or someone else she should fear? She grabbed her flashlight, clutching it like a weapon, her pulse quickening. "Emily!" A voice called out, faint but unmistakable. "Emily, it's Grandpa." Relief flooded her body, bringing tears to her eyes. "Grandpa!" she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. She tried to turn her wheelchair toward the sound, but the uneven ground made it impossible. Instead, She waved her flashlight frantically, the beam bouncing off the trees. Shadow stiffened at the noise, his ears flattening slightly. He moved closer to Emily, standing protectively by her side. She placed a trembling hand on his fur, whispering, "It's okay. That's my grandpa. He's here to help." The sound of footsteps grew louder, and moments later, John appeared through the trees, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. His rugged face, usually stoic, was etched with worry and exhaustion. But when his eyes landed on Emily, a wave of relief softened his features. "Emily!" he exclaimed, rushing toward her. He dropped to his knees beside her wheelchair, his hands shaking as he cupped her face. "Thank God. I was so scared I wouldn't find you." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she clung to him. "I thought you wouldn't come," she sobbed, her voice muffled against his jacket. "Mom left me here." "She just left." John's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger, but he pushed it aside. "You're safe now, kiddo. I've got you." As he pulled back, his gaze shifted to Shadow, who stood just behind Emily, his golden eyes locked on John. The wolf's posture was calm but watchful, and John froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his side. "Don't!" Emily cried, placing herself between John and Shadow. "He's not going to hurt us. He's been protecting me." John hesitated, his eyes flicking between Emily and the wolf. He had spent enough time in the woods to know how dangerous wild animals could be, but Shadow's behavior didn't match that of any wolf he'd encountered. The animal didn't growl or bare its teeth. It simply stood its ground, as if waiting for John to prove himself. "Are you sure, Emily?" John asked cautiously. "Yes," she said firmly. "He stayed with me all night. He scared off other animals. He's the reason I'm okay." John exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. He nodded at Shadow, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "All right then. Thank you, boy." Shadow's ears twitched at the words, but he didn't move. John turned his attention back to Emily, inspecting her for injuries. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" "I'm okay," Emily assured him. "Just cold and really tired." "Let's get you out of here," John said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. He positioned himself behind her wheelchair, testing the uneven terrain. "It's going to be rough, but I'll get you home." As he began pushing the wheelchair, Shadow followed closely, his eyes scanning the forest as if anticipating danger. The journey was slow, the ground uneven and dotted with obstacles. Several times, John had to lift the wheelchair over large roots or rocks, his muscles straining with effort. "You've got a guardian angel here," John remarked, glancing at Shadow. "Never seen anything like it." Emily smiled faintly, exhaustion evident in her face. "I think he's more than that. He's my friend." When they finally broke through the tree line and reached the edge of the farm, Emily felt a surge of relief. The familiar sight of the weathered farmhouse brought tears to her eyes. Mary stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly as she waited. When she saw them, she ran down the steps, her face a mixture of joy and worry. "Emily!" she cried, wrapping her arms around her granddaughter as soon as they reached her. "Oh, thank God. I was so scared." "I'm okay, Grandma," Emily said softly, her voice muffled against Mary's shoulder. "I'm okay." As Mary fussed over Emily, John turned to Shadow. The wolf stood at the edge of the woods, watching the reunion with an unreadable expression. John stepped closer, his voice low. "You're something else, aren't you? Thank you for keeping her safe." Shadow didn't move. His eyes lingered on Emily one last time before he turned and disappeared into the trees, his dark form blending seamlessly with the shadows. Emily watched him go, her chest tightening. "Goodbye, Shadow," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but in her heart, she knew she would never forget him. The forest seemed to exhale a breath of relief as Emily, John, and Mary finally emerged from its dark embrace. The morning sun painted the landscape in warm hues, but Emily's heart was heavy as she glanced back toward the tree line. Shadow was gone, his dark figure having melted into the dense woods. The wolf's presence had been a beacon of safety, and without him, she felt strangely exposed. Mary fussed over Emily as John maneuvered her wheelchair through the uneven path leading to the farmhouse. "You're freezing," Mary said, draping a thick blanket over Emily's shoulders. Her hands were trembling, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "We need to get you inside and warm. I'll make you some soup. You must be starving." "I'm fine, Grandma," Emily replied, though her voice was soft and weary. She hadn't realized how hungry or cold she was until she felt the warmth of the blanket. "I just want to rest." John pushed the wheelchair with steady determination, his jaw set and his eyes narrowed in thought. Emily knew him well enough to recognize that his silence meant he was stewing over what had happened. He hadn't asked about Karen yet, but Emily could feel the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. As they approached the house, John finally broke the silence. "Emily," he began, his voice gruff but gentle. Did she say anything to you before she left?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the blanket. She didn't want to relive the moment, but she knew she had to tell him. "She said she needed a break," she murmured, "that it was peaceful out there. Then she walked away and didn't come back." Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She left you alone in the forest? How could she?" Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. John's hands tightened on the wheelchair's handles. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his anger in check. "We'll deal with Karen later," he said firmly. "Right now, let's focus on getting you cleaned up and fed." As they reached the porch, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The night had taken a toll on her body and mind, and the comfort of home was almost overwhelming. John lifted her gently from the wheelchair, carrying her up the steps and into the warmth of the house. The familiar smell of wood smoke and freshly brewed coffee enveloped her, and for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt safe. Mary set about preparing a meal while John placed Emily on the couch, propping her up with pillows. "You're staying right here," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "No more adventures for a while." Emily managed a small smile. "I didn't exactly plan this one," John grunted in response, his lips twitching in a brief smile despite his lingering anger. He knelt beside her, his rough hands covering hers. "We'll get through this, sweetheart. You're stronger than anyone I know." As they sat in silence for a moment, Emily's thoughts drifted back to Shadow. The wolf had been more than just a protector. He had been a symbol of resilience and trust in a world that had felt utterly hostile. She wondered if she'd ever see him again. Mary returned with a steaming bowl of soup and a plate of buttered toast. "Eat," she said gently, placing the tray on Emily's lap. "You need your strength." Emily took a sip of the soup, its warmth spreading through her body like a balm. "Thank you, Grandma." Mary sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "You've been through so much, my dear. But you're safe now. We'll make sure of it." Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. The forest loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of what she had endured. But it also held the memory of Shadow, the wolf who had stood by her side when she had no one else. "Grandpa," she said softly, her eyes still on the trees, "do you think Shadow will be okay?" John followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "That wolf's got more smarts and heart than most people I know. He'll be fine, Emily." "He's where he belongs." Emily nodded, though a pang of sadness lingered in her chest. She didn't know if she'd ever see Shadow again, but she knew he had left an indelible mark on her life. His quiet strength had inspired her, and she would carry that with her forever. As the morning sunlight bathed the farmhouse in golden light, Emily allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. She was home, and for now, that was enough. The days following Emily's rescue passed in a blur of quiet recovery. Mary hovered over her like a protective shield, bringing meals, adjusting her pillows, and brushing her hair with tender hands. John was quieter, spending most of his time working outside, but Emily often caught him pausing to glance at her, his eyes heavy with worry and something else, guilt. Emily spent much of her time by the large living room window, staring out at the edge of the forest. The trees, once menacing in the dead of night, now stood tall and peaceful in the daylight. But her thoughts always drifted back to Shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf wasn't just a coincidence, but a part of something larger she couldn't quite understand. "Do you think Shadow is okay out there?" she asked one afternoon, her voice breaking the stillness of the room. Mary, who was folding laundry nearby, paused and looked over at her granddaughter. "I'm sure he is," she said softly. "Wolves are resilient creatures. They know how to survive." Emily nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy her. Shadow wasn't just any wolf. He had stayed by her side, protected her, and understood her in ways she couldn't explain. There was something different about him, something that felt almost human. Later that evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, John came in from the barn, his boots caked with dirt. He washed his hands at the sink and sat across from Emily at the kitchen table. His expression was thoughtful, and Emily could tell he'd been mulling something over. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but low, "I've been thinking about that wolf." Emily perked up, her fingers tightening around the mug of tea Mary had made for her. "What about him?" John leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the table. "I've spent my whole life around these woods. I've seen wolves before, sure, but never one that acts like that. It's almost like he knew you needed help." Emily nodded eagerly. "That's what I've been trying to say. It's like he understood everything. He wasn't just protecting me. He was watching over me." John rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There's something about animals, especially wolves. They sense things we can't. Some folks say they're guardians of the wild, that they protect what's important." Emily's eyes widened. "Do you think he was watching over me on purpose? Like he knew?" John gave a small shrug. "Could be. Or maybe you were just lucky. Either way, that wolf did something I'll never forget." The conversation lingered in Emily's mind long after John left the room. She stared out the window again, her thoughts racing. Was Shadow still nearby? Had he returned to some hidden pack deep in the forest? Or was he watching her even now, from the cover of the trees? That night, she dreamed of Shadow. In her dream, the wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes locked onto hers. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just watched, his presence steady and strong. When she reached out to him, he turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving her with a strange sense of peace. The next morning, Emily woke with a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a deep connection to Shadow, one that went beyond gratitude. He had been there for her in her darkest moment, and she wanted to honor that in some way. She asked John if she could borrow one of his journals. Sitting by the window with a pen in hand, she began to write about her experience, about the fear, the desperation, and the unbreakable bond she had formed with a wolf she named Shadow. The words flowed easily, and for the first time in days, she felt like she was regaining a piece of herself. John noticed her writing one afternoon and smiled faintly. "You've got a story worth telling, kiddo. Keep at it." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't know if she'd ever see Shadow again, but she was determined to keep his memory alive. He had taught her something invaluable, that strength doesn't always roar, and that even in the wildest, most unpredictable moments, there can be kindness and connection. As she wrote, a low, distant howl echoed through the woods. Emily paused, her pen hovering above the page. She looked out the window, her heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable. "Shadow," she whispered. The howl faded, leaving only the rustling of the trees in its wake. Emily smiled softly, her fingers brushing against the journal's pages. Shadow might have returned to the wild, but a part of him would always be with her, in her heart and in her words. The peaceful rhythm of life at the farmhouse was disrupted one crisp morning when a car pulled up the gravel driveway. Emily recognized the vehicle immediately and felt her stomach tighten. It was Karen. John had been chopping wood outside when he saw the car. His expression darkened as he dropped the axe and marched toward the house. Mary appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of worry and anger. Emily sat by the window, her heart racing as she watched her mother step out of the car, her movements stiff and reluctant. Karen looked the same as always, her slim figure draped in a designer coat, her makeup carefully applied to mask her exhaustion. But there was something different in her posture, a hesitance that wasn't usually there. She glanced up at the house, her eyes briefly meeting Emily's through the window before she looked away. John reached her first, his voice low and tense. "What are you doing here?" Karen flinched at his tone, but tried to recover, brushing her hair behind her ear. "I came to check on Emily," she said, her voice defensive. "I heard she got home safe." "Safe?" John repeated, his voice rising. "You abandoned her in the middle of the woods, Karen. She could have died out there." Karen's face flushed, and she crossed her arms. "I didn't abandon her. Don't you dare try to justify this," Mary interrupted, stepping down from the porch to join John. Her usual gentle demeanor was gone, replaced by a rare fierceness. "You left your daughter alone, helpless, in the middle of nowhere. What were you thinking?" Karen's lips tightened, and she looked away. I wasn't thinking clearly. I needed space. She's not easy to take care of, you know that?" Emily felt the sting of her mother's words from inside the house. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wouldn't let Karen's cruelty define her. "Not easy to take care of?" John growled, stepping closer to Karen. "She's a child, Karen. Your child. And she's stronger than you'll ever be." Karen's eyes filled with tears, though whether they were from guilt or self-pity, Emily couldn't tell. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I couldn't handle it anymore." "That's not an excuse," Mary said firmly. "You don't get to walk away when things get hard. You're her mother." Karen's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the ground. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I made a mistake." John shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "A mistake? Karen, this wasn't just a mistake. This was neglect. You don't get to walk in here and act like an apology is enough." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when Emily appeared in the doorway. Her wheelchair squeaked softly as she rolled forward, her face pale but composed. "Mom," Emily said, her voice steady. "Why did you leave me?" Karen turned to face her daughter, her expression crumbling. "Emily, I thought you'd be okay. I thought someone would find you. I didn't mean for it to get so bad." Emily's eyes narrowed, her hurt shining through. "You didn't mean for it to get so bad? You left me in the middle of the woods with no way to move. Do you know how scared I was? How helpless I felt?" Karen covered her face with her hands, her voice muffled as she replied, "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't know what else to do." "You could have asked for help," Emily shot back. "You could have talked to Grandpa or Grandma. But instead, you just left me like I didn't matter." The weight of Emily's words hung heavy in the air. Karen dropped her hands and looked at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I do care about you," she whispered. I don't know how to handle everything." Emily's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't relent. "You don't have to handle everything alone. But you can't treat me like I'm a burden." "I'm not a burden. I'm your daughter." Karen nodded slowly, her expression a mix of regret and realization. "You're right," she said. "I've been selfish. I need to be better." John stepped forward, his voice firm. "If you want to be better, Karen, then start by taking responsibility for what you've done. Emily deserves better than excuses." Karen nodded again, wiping her tears. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll get help. For me. For her." Emily didn't respond immediately. She turned her wheelchair and rolled back toward the house. At the door, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Mom, but I hope you mean what you're saying." Karen nodded silently, tears streaming down her face. As Emily disappeared into the house, John and Mary exchanged a look. Karen's apology might have been a start, but rebuilding trust would take much more. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly touching.